Power was never enough for Joseph Stalin. He wanted obedience, he wanted fear, and he built a system that turned both into weapons. It's tempting to break history into clean categories of tidy timelines, start and stop dates, good guys and bad guys. But life isn't neat, and neither was Joseph Stalin's reign. The most chilling part is that the enemy didn't need to exist, he could be invented. The Great Terror of 1937 to 1938 was a psychological campaign against the very fabric of Soviet life. In just 2 years, more than half of the USSR's general grade army officers, 1,844 of them, were repressed, and at least 780 were executed. 3 of the top 5 military leaders were gone. Under Stalin's twisted logic, anyone could become an enemy of the people. You didn't have to act out, you didn't even need to speak, you just had to be connected to the wrong book, the wrong neighbour, the wrong memory. Suddenly, you were accused of treason, espionage, or sabotage. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, didn't need evidence. They needed numbers. Terror, by then, became a tool to destroy independent qualities that might one day pose a threat. It didn't matter who you were, if you stood out, you were already marked.
Welcome to Unveiled History.
Before he became the iron-fisted ruler of the Soviet Union, Stalin was an unremarkable revolutionary, often overlooked and often doubted. Men like Leon Trotsky and Nikolai Bukharin once stood shoulder to shoulder with him during the 1917 revolution. They had seen him unsure, unpolished, and undereducated. That memory alone made them dangerous in Stalin's eyes. So, when power finally found its way into his hands, Stalin turned on those who had once called him comrade. Some of them were real rising threats from Nazi Germany and militarist Japan, but most were imagined. And so, he began to purge. He didn't call it that, of course. He used terms like fifth column, enemy of the people, and saboteur, words that made it sound like a matter of national survival. The purge began quickly, but it would end in the screams of millions. First came the whispers, that Trotsky was plotting, that Bukharin was undermining the cause, that the original Bolsheviks, the heroes of the revolution, were not loyal to the new Soviet dream. And so by the mid-1930s, Stalin had become obsessed with the idea that betrayal was everywhere. He believed that the revolution's greatest threat came not from enemies abroad, but from those who knew him before. And so began the Great Purge. A brutal campaign to silence dissent, eliminate rivals, and scare the Soviet people into submission. It all started with a single gunshot. Sergei Kirov, a popular Bolshevik leader, was gunned down in 1934. Rumours swirled that Stalin himself had ordered the hit. After all, Kirov criticised Stalin's harsh policies like forced collectivization, which had caused deadly famines and driven Stalin's own wife to suicide. Stalin showed up at the funeral, carrying Kirov's coffin, as if to prove his innocence. But it was too late. Kirov's death became the excuse Stalin needed to begin the bloodletting. He announced that the party had been infiltrated by traitors and spies, and with that, the arrests began. The trials followed with scripted confessions and fabricated evidence, all broadcast for the world to see. 4 infamous trials between 1936 and 1938 paraded former allies, decorated generals, and even Lenin's closest confidants before the nation, only to sentence them to death. Behind closed doors, the NKVD became the hammer of terror. Courtrooms were replaced with troikas, which were 3-person panels that handed down death sentences in minutes. Public trials were just theatre. The real purge was happening in the shadows. Everyone was the target. It started with political rivals, then the military, then artists, scientists, priests, ethnic minorities, foreigners, and even children. A 12-year-old could be executed if their parent was accused. Wives were forced to denounce their husbands, friends vanished without a word. One day your neighbour shared a meal with you, the next, their apartment door was sealed shut. Forever. As one woman, Marksena Mikhailovka, would later say, everyone knew, but no one ever spoke of it. The fear was everywhere, but Stalin wasn't done. In 1937, he turned to the Red Army. These were the men who had built Soviet power, who had fought for him, who had bled for the revolution. But to Stalin, even they had grown too powerful. He believed a coup was coming. So he preemptively destroyed the military's leadership. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, once hailed as the Red Napoleon, was one of the first to fall. He was a brilliant strategist, the deputy commander of the Red Army, but brilliance was a liability under Stalin. In June 1937, he was arrested, accused of espionage, and shot. With him went a cascade of others. Iona Yakir, Yerenim Uborovich, Vitovot Putner, Robert Eiderman, and Jan Galit, all senior commanders, all executed in the same month. By the time Stalin was done, 3 out of 5 Soviet marshals were dead, 13 or 15 top army and 50 of 57 corps commanders were gone. The carnage didn't stop there. 154 of 186 division commanders were eliminated. 8 of the 9 admirals were executed. But it wasn't just the men with medals. Commissars, the ideological backbone of the army, were wiped out too. All 16 army commissars and 25 of 28 corps commissars were purged. In total, around 35,000 officers were executed, imprisoned, or simply made to vanish. What had made it even more devastating was many of them believed in Stalin. They had pledged loyalty and marched under his banner. But in Stalin's world, the more devoted you were, the more dangerous you seemed. The cost was immeasurable. With his army in ruins, Stalin's USSR staggered into war unprepared, losing tens of thousands before they could even fight back. But by then, Stalin didn't care. Labour camps overflowed and execution lists were signed like grocery bills. As Stalin once said, who remembers the boyars Ivan the Terrible got rid of? No one. And maybe that was the plan. The Red Army purge shattered the spine of the Soviet military. When Hitler invaded in 1941, Stalin's army wasn't ready. It couldn't be. The men who had once led it had been executed or silenced. In their place stood terrified, inexperienced commanders, many of them too afraid to act without permission. And it showed. Within months, the Nazis had ripped through Soviet defences. Ukraine, Belarus, and half of Russia fell like dominoes. Millions of soldiers were either killed or captured. The purge buried innovation. Marshal Tukhachevsky's groundbreaking deep battle strategy, which could have changed everything, was tossed aside with his body. Officers stopped thinking for themselves, and obedience replaced initiative. After all, even a raised eyebrow could mean a bullet to the head. Hitler, watching from Berlin, saw a broken army, and he wasn't wrong. No one knows the exact number. Some say 750,000 were killed. Others say twice that, maybe more. Because many never got a trial, never made it to a prison camp, and never had a name written down. They were simply gone. This was Stalin's Great Terror. And no name represented Stalin's obsession with betrayal more than Leon Trotsky, the man who had once stood at the very heart of the revolution. Trotsky had helped orchestrate the Bolshevik uprising in 1917. He had built the Red Army from scratch. He had been a brilliant speaker, an intellectual force, and Lenin's natural successor in the eyes of many. But to Stalin, that legacy was a threat. Trotsky had helped shape who Stalin had been before power. And worse, he refused to stay silent. After being exiled from the Soviet Union, Trotsky became Stalin's living reminder of a different future. He wrote books, gave speeches, and criticised the totalitarian regime unfolding back home. For that, Stalin could never forgive him, and so he hunted him. Trotsky was forced to move from country to country: Turkey, France, Norway, and finally, Mexico. But nowhere was far enough. On August 21st, 1940, a Spanish communist and Soviet agent infiltrated Trotsky's compound and drove an ice pick into his skull. Trotsky died the next day. Stalin may not have held the weapon, but he had issued the order. It was a final act in a long vendetta, and Trotsky was a ghost Stalin couldn't tolerate. By 1938, the official terror was said to be over, but the fear lived on. People still whispered, still checked over their shoulders, still flinched at a late-night knock. Even during World War II, Stalin continued executing prisoners, especially Poles. The war only gave him new reasons to kill, and when peace returned, the repression didn't stop. It only shifted. Years later, Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, would call it what it was: an abuse of power. But by then, the damage was done. Stalin had reshaped a nation, not with hope, but with fear. Because greatness built on bones is still a graveyard, and for many, the Great Terror never really ended. It just got quieter.